Good evening, everyone. On behalf of MSN Labs Private Limited, I welcome all the master faculties for today's scientific session. And at the same time, I would like to also welcome all the guest audience for today's our scientific session. Today's topic for this scientific session is the management of pulmonary hypertension in the cardiologist as well as pulmonologist perspective. And before getting into the today's scientific session, I would like to have your kind permission just to have a brief introduction of our organization as a whole, sir. Innovation resonates a sense of purpose in the evolution and existence of human life. The creative capacity of human minds has always been the source of inspiration. We believe every life matters and everyone deserves quality medicine. Apart from the efficacy, affordability, and accessibility, we want to be the first to touch and impact human lives. So we at MSN research for better medicine. Our quest for innovation drives us to serve better and better for today and tomorrow. As we have the Asia's largest integrated pharmaceutical API and R&D center, so that's why we are able to research for the better medicine, sir. So meet the global Indian pharmaceutical company, which is having a turnover crossing 600 million US dollar, presence in 65 countries globally and 8 offices worldwide, including US and UK. We have got 11,000 workforce globally. We have won the trust of more than 4 crore customers across 65 countries. And we have got integrated state-of-art R&D center and 14 manufacturing facilities in India and USA. So that's why how we are able to make our tricolor proud, how we research for the better medicine, sir. We have got the Indian spirit for making tricolor proud, as we have got 250 plus products in pipeline, 600 patents globally, 715 world's largest DMFs in US, and 45 dossiers submitted in the other major markets like EU, European Union, Canada, and Australia. And what we are able to do in the US market, sir, we have got 100 plus ANDs submitted in US, 25 products approval in US, and 20 plus product tentative approvals in US market. And we have 17 products commercialized in the US market. So these are some of the journeys of MSN that we could do first time in India, sir. In 2013, we brought these molecules like prasugrel, febuxostat, tapentadol, and tolvaptan for the first time. And in 2015, we brought this dexlansoprazole, roflumilast, vilazodone for the first time in India. And 2016, we brought lurasidone. And in 2017, we brought a couple of molecules like ambrisentan, amlodipine, sildosin, azilsartan, mirabegron, macitentan, and rioshigod. And in 2020, we brought triantine. And in now 2021, we have brought this DAPA1, this is dapagliflozin, and tofacitinib, that is tofadose. So these are some of the innovations which we could do in the field of pulmonary arterial hypertension. We brought for the first time bosentan. Then in 2012, we brought Tadovas, is our tadalafil. Then ambrisentan. And in 2013, we brought the US FDA approved dose for sildenafil, that is the PS20, the 20 mg TID doses. And in 2017, we brought the combination of ambrisentan, tadalafil. We also brought macitentan and rioshigod for the first time in India in the PS subset. So in this journey, sir, we want to partner in practice and MSN expertise to research to innovate brought for the first time in India launches to support super specialists in bringing down Indian patient sufferings. We are who to better stand by you and company with the global research, global manufacturing, and global quality, a company which has acquired trust globally. We at MSN on a journey to serve you better and better. To partner in creating awareness in management of pulmonary and hypertension in cardiologists and pulmonologist perspective, efforts for emergent treatment options that to increase the patient life expectancy. Today's our session is there. And in this session, sir, we have got one of the eminent personality from all India in the field of cardiology, who is our moderator for the session. We have got Dr. Rajiv Karnik. Dr. Rajiv Karnik, who is working as a director for health, heart failure clinic and intervention cardiologist in Fortis Hospital, Mumbai. He has secured 6 gold medals during his course of education that is unique, having a distinction of topping University of Bombay. In 1994, he was invited as a visiting clinician in Mayo Clinic, USA, and he pursued a fellowship from European FESC as well as FSCA as well as he was a premium professional member in the American Heart Association and also member in CSI, API, RSSDI, and Critical Care Medicine and American College of Cardiology. In 2002, he was bestowed with the Rashtriya Ratan Award. So Dr. Karnik is our moderator for today's session. Then I would like to introduce our first speaker for the session. We have got Dr. Prashant Gobate, who is a consultant pediatric cardiologist in KDAH, that is Kokilaben Hospital in Bombay. And he is a renowned personality in the field of pulmonary arterial hypertension because he is among those pioneer persons who is able to do so many things in the field of pulmonary arterial hypertension. And he is a consultant pediatric cardiologist in the Kokilaben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital. He pursued Young Investigator Award from the Mumbai Post-Stunt in end-stage pulmonary hypertension. Dr. Prashant is having 12 years of experience in the diagnosis and management of patients with the CSD as well as the pulmonary hypertension. He pursued fellowship in the pediatric cardiology from Escorts Heart Institute and Research Center that is based at New Delhi and pulmonary hypertension specialization from the Canada. He published more than 20 articles in national and international journals and 6 chapters in textbook of pediatric cardiology as well as in cardiology and pulmonary hypertension. And Dr. Prashant has also attended the faculty at annual conferences of PSCI, CSI, IAP, and he is member from Southeast Asia and the organizing committee of pulmonary hypertension stream of World Congress of Pediatric Cardiology and Surgery at Washington. Dr. Prashant started a PH clinic in KDAH, which offers a comprehensive evaluation and management of pulmonary hypertension with more than 400 patient database. So this is some brief about Dr. Prashant. Then I would like to introduce our second speaker for the session. We have got Dr. Mahavir Modi. He is a consultant pulmonologist in Pune with an experience of 14 years. Dr. Mahavir is a consultant pulmonologist in Ruby Health Clinic at Pune. And in March 2019, Dr. Mahavir achieved an award of Bharat Ratna Indira Gandhi Gold Medal by GPRA in Bangalore. He was co-secretary for 4th National Conference of Chest Care of India, that is CCI-CON. In 2017, he was organizing committee member in ILD CON's conferences at iconic international conferences on COPD in Pune. He was course director for asthma and COPD in Pune, and he pursued fellowship in international pulmonology, Italy, under guidance by Dr. Stefano Gasparrini. He published various national and international publications on journals, and in 2017, he worked as a faculty for sleep apnea and parasomniasis in Kolkata. In 2018, Dr. Mahavir invited as a speaker for sleep update by AC School of Sleep Medicine in Delhi. So this is some brief about today's session for our moderator as well as for both the speakers. With this brief introduction, I would like to hand over the session to today's our moderator, Dr. Rashtriya Karnik, sir. Sir.
Yeah, can you stop sharing, please?
Yes, sir.
So that I can start sharing from my side. Yes, am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Great. First of all, profuse thanks to MSN Pharma for making this event occur, and especially the topic that is pulmonary arterial hypertension. Very few conferences are generally held on pulmonary arterial hypertension, and it is very commendable that MSN has organized this conference. In fact, last year in ACC 2020, the title of this slide is Unaddressed Global Health Burden. That was the opening sentence by a great personality like Magdi Yacoub in ACC 2020. He said it is unaddressed global health burden. And it has got grave prognosis if untreated. And as you can see here, just with 6-minute walk test, merely the distance that person travels, if it is less than 333 and more than 333 meter, there is a vast difference in the Kaplan-Meier curve in terms of survival. But the right-hand side is quite bright outlook that if you can give effective and good treatment, if you can stratify the patient well, if you diagnose, stratify, and give appropriate treatment, and if you can succeed in bringing down the BNP, brain natriuretic peptide, to below 180, then you can have again below 180 versus above 180 at the end of this thing treatment period or follow-up BNP. Again, there is a vast difference in Kaplan-Meier curve, survival curve. So you can achieve that much by just giving appropriate treatment. Now, looking at this humongous success in the survival, the trials which were initially concentrating only on the surrogate endpoint, like 6-minute walk test and then pulmonary function and pulmonary artery pressure and so on and so forth. So they have now changed over the paradigm shift of trial, primary endpoints, secondary endpoints had turned over into outcome trials. Just like in diabetes, where now we are for last 15 years, we are seeing all the outcome trials. Similarly, here also, in pulmonary arterial hypertension, we have now outcome trials like GIRFON and AMBITION and TRITON and so on and so forth. And that can be achieved because we have great armamentarium as on today. Earlier, when I started, let us say, my cardiology in 1980s, we had nothing but just the digoxin, diuretic. Dr. Munshi used to tell us to give warfarin or acetrom in these cases, thinking that majority of these cases may be thromboembolic pH, but nothing else was there. Not even sildenafil was there. But now today we have 3 important pathways: endothelin pathway, nitric oxide pathway, and prostacyclin pathway. For this endothelin pathway, we have this, of course, this macitentan, bosentan, macitentan. So all these drugs which are there, MSN themselves, they are providing us. For nitric oxide pathway, this phosphodiesterase, we have again sildenafil, tadalafil is available, and even for this thing soluble GMP increment by guanylyl cyclase promoter. So for that, riociguat and rifaciguat, those medicines are also available for us. But more importantly, I'm very happy to note and very happy to hear from MSN that the last pathway, that is prostacyclin pathway, for which all these years we had those inhaled and intravenous and subcutaneous prostacyclin analogs, which are very difficult, and you cannot go on inhaling in the public, and then very costly treatment you cannot afford also. As opposed to that, we have now this very specific molecule which works on prostacyclin pathway, and that is selexipag, which MSN is going to make it available in the due course of time. And with all these medicines, what this slide shows that we started with monotherapy, then sequential combo, then initial combo, and and in today's day, there can be initial combo or very targeted risk stratification oriented treatment with all these trials which are there to guide us, which will be discussed by our great speakers. And then currently, it's not even 2 combination, but even triple combination, which was recently presented in this Amsterdam virtual meet of European Society of Cardiology, that TRITON study, in which initial triple therapy with macitentan, tadalafil, and selexipag, which all the 3 drugs are, selexipag is upcoming and the other 2 are already available. And then it showed again, as you can see, very great success with initial triple therapy. I'm not saying that each and every case we are going to offer them all this costly medicine, because the cost does matter. But again, we are a little fortunate in India. As you can see here in the USA, this slide, this is the last slide of mine, which just states what is the cost like for ambrisentan, macitentan, and then which is just, you can see that just for one tablet, it is costing something like $386, $370. As opposed to that, in India, we have 5 milligram of ambrisentan is $369 in USA. As opposed to that, we have just 145, just $2 a day, $2 a tablet. And same thing about macitentan and tadalafil and so on and so forth. And selexipag, which is in fact costing in USA $192 a tab. I'm very sure that MSN will come at very affordable cost in India, and then we will be able to give this initial, as I said, not the sequential, in fact, initial combo treatment because of affordability. Because as we saw in the first slide, that greater the reduction in in BNP and then improvement in the 6-minute walk test, there is a humongous benefit in terms of survival. And to discuss all these, the proper diagnosis, proper stratification, proper treatment, proper combination, and especially in two different fields, that is cardiology and pulmonology, we have very great two brilliant speakers. Dr. Prashant, as it was introduced, he is very apt candidate to speak about it because he has fellowship in pulmonary hypertension. And second great speaker, brilliant speaker, is Dr. Mahavir Modi. He is a master from Pune. He's a master of COPD, master of ILD. So I don't think MSN could have found better personalities than these two speakers to address this very difficult topic of and very uncommonly addressed topic of pulmonary arterial hypertension. So I just end my slide sharing here, and I will invite Dr. Prashant. The stage is for you. Thank you very much, dear delegates.
Sir, you are muted. Dr. Prashant, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank MSN for organizing this conference. As Dr. Karnik has already mentioned, it's a rare disease, so the conferences are also rare in pulmonary arterial hypertension. I would also like to thank Dr. Karnik for the kind introduction which he has given. And without much delay, what we will do is we will start how do we manage pulmonary arterial hypertension, and we'll give you a cardiologist perspective. As we all know, pulmonary hypertension is basically it's a multi-system disorder, and we always require a team to take care of pulmonary hypertension. You need a cardiologist, you need a pediatric cardiologist, you need a pulmonologist, a rheumatologist, an exercise therapist, a counselor. All these people are required to manage pulmonary hypertension, and we'll get a glimpse of what we are kind of doing in the world of pulmonary hypertension for the last 4 to 5 years. So we'll discuss the definition, clinical features of pulmonary hypertension, evaluation, management, and and if time permits, certain cases to highlight the importance of systematic evaluation of patients with pulmonary hypertension. So what is the definition of pulmonary hypertension? And it would depend upon whom you're asking, whether you're asking a cardiologist, a pediatric cardiologist, a neonatologist, a cardiac intensivist, or a pathologist. Let's get to see what is happening. And in 1973 was the first definition of pulmonary hypertension which was given by World Symposium, and they had given an arbitrary value of mean PA pressure of more than or equal to 25 millimeters of mercury as measured by right heart cath in supine position. The limitations of that were 25 millimeters of mercury by itself is arbitrary, and we'll discuss in the next slide why is it so. And it does not address various pathophysiologies which could be the cause of pulmonary hypertension, whether it's pre-capillary, post-capillary, or whether it is a combination of both. So this study in 2009 was published by European Respiratory Journal, and here we found that a normal mean PA pressures, even if you take plus 3 standard deviations in systolic, is 34 millimeters of mercury, and mean is 20 millimeters of mercury. So the question was, what is happening to these patients in which the mean PA pressure is between 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury? And this patient, especially in certain subgroups such as systemic sclerosis and thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, they were really missing out on therapy, because in our country it's still okay, but in the Western world, unless you do a right heart cath and demonstrate that the mean PA pressure was more than 25, it was not allowed to prescribe pulmonary vasodilators in these patients. And the prognosis of these patients was much worse. If you had a PA pressure between 20 to 25 was much worse as compared to if you had a mean PA pressure of less than 20, especially in conditions such as systemic sclerosis and thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. So in 2018, the conference was held, and 2019, the paper was published. Again, this is a World Conference of Pulmonary Hypertension, was held in Nice 2018. And here the definition was now revised to mean PA pressure of more than 20 millimeters mercury is what is called as pulmonary hypertension. And then they divided it into pre-capillary, post-capillary, and combined pre and post-capillary. And we can see the definition which is there on the screen right now. What are the clinical features of pulmonary hypertension, we all know these usually occur in young adults in the second or third decade of life. They usually have non-specific complaints, easy fatigue, palpitations, and they only come to us when they have an advanced heart disease such as right heart failure with syncope, pre-syncope, and edema. And the reason why I'm telling is because of these non-specific complaints which the patients have, they most often are not, more often than not, they are said to be functional, and there is an average delay of approximately 3 to 4 years between the onset of the symptoms and the actual diagnosis of pulmonary hypertension. And as we all know, as Dr. Karnik has also said, that the earlier we start the treatment, the better for these patients. So we have to try to get down this delay from 2 to 4 years to even lesser than this. Next part of the presentation will discuss about how should we investigate and treat a patient with pulmonary hypertension. And these are slightly old guidelines in European Heart Journal 2009, but I still like to use them because they are the ones which lucidly describe how we evaluate a patient of pulmonary hypertension stepwise. There are not many changes from the new in the new guidelines, so we'll continue to see. So if you have a patient who has signs and symptoms suggestive of pulmonary hypertension, we do non-invasive evaluation in the form of ECG and echocardiogram and see if the patient has features of pulmonary hypertension. If he has, then see if he has group 2, that is left heart disease, or group 3, that is lung disease, or pulmonary or secondary to hypoxia. We also do, and this is very important, an ECG, a chest exogram, a transthoracic echocardiogram, pulmonary function test, and HRCT chest. And in that, if we find that the pH is proportionate to the severity, then we treat the underlying cause. If we find underlying cause, if we don't find a cause, or if we think that the pH is out of proportion to the group 2 or group 3 pulmonary hypertension, then we perform a VQ scan. It's an extremely important study to look for VQ scan. CT scan can diagnose most of the cases of pulmonary thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, but before labeling somebody as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension, we should always do a VQ scan because that is the one which will tell us whether grade 4 of thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension can be missed by CT scan. If there are no segmental perfusion defects, go and do a right heart catheterization. And once you reach a diagnosis of pulmonary hypertension, we also do an HR look for secondary causes of pulmonary hypertension, such as pulmonary veno-occlusive disease, pulmonary capillary hemangiomatosis, thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. Look into the history, see if there is any history of hereditary pulmonary hypertension, an HIV test, and do all these tests which are mentioned in the table, and only label a patient as idiopathic or heritable pulmonary hypertension when none of these causes or none of these tests reveal anything. And because as we all say, and as we'll see in the presentation, idiopathic pulmonary hypertension is a dustbin diagnosis unless we have any other. If you have the first important thing is to find out if there is a cause of any pulmonary hypertension. Then we go to the management of pulmonary arterial hypertension. And when we say that pulmonary arterial hypertension is more often than not either idiopathic or heritable pulmonary arterial hypertension when we are not finding the cause for pulmonary hypertension. And as Dr. Karnik said, the method of treating this pulmonary hypertension patients has gone on from monotherapy to sequential combination therapy to the initial upfront combination therapy and now risk stratification. And risk stratification is extremely important in patients with pulmonary hypertension because that is which is going to determine how we are going to treat these patients with pulmonary hypertension. We look at the WHO functional class, we look at the 6-minute walk test, we look at the NT-proBNP levels and the cardiac index of these patients, and divide the patients into 3 subgroups: low risk groups, intermediate risk groups, and high risk groups, and try to get your patient as soon as possible into the low risk groups. And an accurate evaluation of the patient not only at the time of diagnosis at the first visit but also also regularly at every follow-up is extremely essential. The other way of assessing severity is by using the REVEAL score, and we do this routinely in our clinic. And what it does, it gives you a number wherein a patient with low risk group has a predicted survival of 95 to 100%, whereas a patient with high risk group, very high risk group, has a survival of less than 70%. We have now a more practical score which is now available, which is known as a Reveal 2 Lite, in which you look at only 4 parameters. We look at the functional class of the patient, we look at the echocardiogram, we look at the NT-proBNP, and we look at the creatinine clearance. It was just published in 2021, and this can be routinely done in all our clinical practice. We know that we can all do these routine things in our clinical practice, and it is extremely important to do this for better treating the patients of pulmonary hypertension. And I think Dr. Karnik has already stressed on it, 3 pathways: nitric oxide or cyclic GMP pathway, which has the phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors and guanine cyclase stimulators, endothelin receptor antagonists such as bosentan, ambrisentan, macitentan, and prostacyclin pathways such as treprostinil, epoprostenol, iloprost, and now selexipag. So these are in a table which are the pH medications which are available in India in each of the pathway. And of course, we have the calcium channel blockers, oxygen, and other miscellaneous ones. Unfortunately, we don't have the prostacyclin pathway medications still available in India. So how do you treat pH patients? Once you have confirmed that the patient has pulmonary hypertension, you take him to the cath lab, do a vasoreactivity testing using inhaled nitric oxide or adenosine, preferably inhaled nitric oxide if it is available. And if the patient is vasoreactive, you start the patient on calcium channel blocker. Now, it is an extremely important test to do, because a patient who is vasoreactive has a much better prognosis as compared to the patient who is not vasoreactive. If the patient is not vasoreactive, you can go with initial combination therapy or upfront combination therapy, depending upon the risk status of the patient. Coming to the calcium channel blockers, it should be used only in patients who have undergone a vasodilator testing. And how do you define and it's also important as to what definition we are using for defining a patient as vasoreactive positive. And this is the most recent definition which has been given by Stibon et al., which says that there has to be a decrease in the mean PA pressure of at least 10 millimeters of mercury to less than 40 millimeters of mercury with increase or no change in cardiac output. It's extremely important that each of these criteria is fulfilled before we label the patient as vasoreactive positive. The incidence is not very high. It's around 6 to 20%. And we all know that inhaled nitric oxide, inhaled or IV epoprostenol or iloprost can be used. And of course, IV adenosine can also be used for checking the reactivity of the patient. But none of the tests are without risk. And this is one of our patients whom we took in the cath lab thinking that he has got idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension. And you can see the X-ray on the right. It is nice and clear. There is mild cardiomegaly, pulmonary artery is prominent. As soon as we gave nitric oxide, the patient started desaturating, mean PA pressure started going up. We had to intubate the patient. He was around 9 years of age. And you can see the patient had developed gross pulmonary edema. So this patient had got pulmonary veno-occlusive disease. We went back, we repeated a CT scan. The previous CT scan did not report pulmonary veno-occlusive disease, but we went back and we have reported this case in Annals of Pediatric Cardiology. And it is extremely important to critically look at the patient CT scan before taking him to the cath lab to avoid this catastrophe. We were lucky, we were able to extubate the child, treat him with diuretics, extubate the child, and send the child home. But in a less equipped cath lab, it might be a problem. And hence, always looking at a CT scan with an expert radiologist who is well versed in assessing the patient of pulmonary hypertension is extremely important. If the patient is responder, you can see this Kaplan-Meier graph. If the patient is long-term calcium channel responder, the survival is extremely good as compared to those who are not responsive long-term for the calcium channel blockers. And this was again given by Stibon et al. And this is the criteria was used by which was given by Stibon et al. So what is our experience? We have around 427 patients with pulmonary hypertension in our clinic, out of which 176 are idiopathic, most of whom we have performed inhaled nitric oxide vasodilator testing. Only one patient had adverse events, which I had mentioned before. 16 patients or 9.1% satisfied the satisfied the criteria. These patients we started on CCBs. Our median follow-up now is 3 years for these patients, and all luckily till now have not lost the vasodilator positivity response to them, and they are only on calcium channel blockers and some small dose of sildenafil. So what are the other existing options which are available? And we all know that this pulmonary vasodilators, all these pulmonary vasodilators are available in India apart from Selexipag. And as Dr. Karnik had said initially, the surrogate endpoint was 6-minute walk test, but now the surrogate endpoint has turned into morbidity and mortality. And these are the recent trials, which was also mentioned previously, Serafin, Griffon, and Ambition trial, which are looking at morbidity and mortality. As you can see, the time duration of this studies have become longer. Initially, the time duration was only maybe 10 weeks, on an average 10 weeks to 20 weeks. Now they are being followed up for much longer, maybe 80 weeks to 100 weeks. And that is the one which is giving a complete picture of the patients with pulmonary hypertension. So, and coming to the another important thing, whether it's an upfront combination therapy versus sequential combination therapy. And this was a study, which is Ambition study, which is now very well known. In 2015, which was published in NEJM, and they found that patients with combination therapy, upfront combination therapy, did much better as compared to any of the single drug, whether it is ambrisentan or the tadalafil group. A combination of ambrisentan and tadalafil in upfront did wonders as compared to patients who did much better as compared to single drug which was given. Now, from here, what we now are going to discuss is whether it is dual combination therapy or triple combination therapy. And this was again presented at the conference which Dr. Karnik mentioned, is assessing the patient, repeated assessing of the patient, and risk assessment of the patient, not only at the baseline, but at every follow-up is extremely important. And if we assess the patients at 3 months after starting the medication, and if this patient did not have any event prior to 3 months, then this patients did much better. So this is the very, very important landmark in the patient's history. If you start the patient on a medication on upfront combination therapy, and you reassess the patient after 3 months, in those 3 months, if the patient is doing much better and the risk stratification of the patient has converted from high risk or intermediate risk to a low risk category, then this patients do extremely important. So risk stratification is important not only at the baseline, but also at every follow-up. And if you see the Optima trial is Optima trial and Ambition trial are the dual combination therapy, and the Triaton trial is a triple combination therapy along with Selexipag. And what is shown that if you see that the increase in the 6-minute walk test is much better with Triaton, the decrease in NT-proBNP is much better with Triaton. 98% had improvement by 26 weeks. And there was a mean reduction of 52% in pulmonary vascular resistance in patients who were upfront triple combination therapy of macitentan, tadalafil, and now Selexipag. However, if you see the primary endpoint in the patients with initial combination therapy or double combination therapy, there is not much difference. The decrease in PVRI in initial combination therapy is 54% versus an initial combination therapy reduction of 52% in patients with double combination, with dual combination, that is macitentan and tadalafil. It's almost the same. The secondary endpoint, that is 6-minute walk test distance, is almost the same again. Then why go for a triple combination therapy? And the reason is over here. If you see the high risk patients, they are on triple combination therapy, their survival is much better as compared to the patients who are on double combination therapy or monotherapy, both in high risk group as well as in the intermediate risk group. So these are the two risk group patients who would benefit maximum if they are on triple combination therapy. So what is our protocol at Kokilaben Ambani Hospital is most of the patients would be started on dual combination therapy, and we So we introduce the patient and tell them about all the therapy which is available in the country as well as outside the country, which is available at the first visit itself. So the patient is mentally prepared as to what is going to come in the future. We spend almost 1.5 hours in telling them that. We have a return visit at 3 months in which do non-invasive risk stratification using the REVEL 2 risk stratification score, and we try to escalate them to triple combination therapy if they are not meeting the low risk criteria. And I'll tell you our experience with triple combination therapy in Kokilaben Ambani Hospital. Most of the times we use iloprost in patients. We have 16 patients who are taking inhale iloprost. 1 patient is on subcutaneous treprostinil and 1 patient is on Selexipag. The reason for choosing iloprost is more than anything else, availability and the cost of iloprost is much less as compared to treprostinil and oral Selexipag, which has to be imported from outside. Our age groups are varying age groups from 3 to 56 years. We use it at a dose of 2.5 to 5 micrograms 6 to 9 times daily. Our follow-up period now is around 18 months. And most of the patients, apart from 2 patients, they have been improved from functional class 3 to 4 to functional class 2. And NT-proBNP has decreased from median of 12,345 to median of 700. So that has been a significant improvement in NT-proBNP after starting that. And there have been no major side effects of starting patients on iloprost apart from and you can see it is a small pocket nebulizer which can be carried, and it's very easy to use. That's our youngest patient who is who is around 5 years now, and we can see that he himself can use the nebulizer and it's so convenient to be used. This is the echocardiographic parameter. We have seen that there is significant improvement in LV eccentricity index, RV fractional area change, TAPC, as well as the pulmonary artery acceleration time in most of the patients whom we have initiated iloprost medications. However, everything is not hunky-dory over here too. So if you see, this is one of our first patients whom we have started on iloprost. She's a doctor by profession. This was way back in April 2015. There was a dramatic improvement in 3 months. From functional class 4, she went to functional class 2. The NT-proBNP dropped from more than 5,000 to less than 600 or 700, I think. And then she was using it nicely and continued to remain in functional class 2 with a low NT-proBNP for a good 2.5 years. Then we can see that slowly it is trying to start to climb up again. And this is the time when we escalated the dose, but it was not giving her any benefit. She was counseled for heart-lung transplant, but they were not willing for heart-lung transplant. So we started on treprostinil in April 2019. And again, you see, once we have started this patient on subcutaneous treprostinil, there has been a drop in her NT-proBNP as well as her improvement in her functional class. This is a picture. So the treprostinil medication can be imported, but the pump is not available in India. So what we improvise, we are using this insulin pump, continuous insulin pump, which is made by Medtronic, and the patient keeps on taking it continuously subcutaneously, and the site has to be changed every 3 to 4 weekly. And now she is, I have to update this, she is in functional class 2 now, and her last NT-proBNP is 628. Now this is medications. Now what can we do for these PH patients beyond the medications is what we'll see. We'll see the role of graded exercise and yoga, atrial septostomy and septectomy, port shunt, ECMO, heart-lung transplant, psychological support, and patient education. Graded exercise testing and yoga. Initially, it was believed that exercise will have a negative impact on progression of disease in pulmonary hypertension and could lead to sudden cardiac death. However, lack of exercises increases anxiety, pushes the patient into depression, increases the weight of the patient. Physical training has shown to improve endothelial function and improves the quality of life. And this was one of the studies from the Canadian Center where I trained, and which had shown that the improvement of physical training and yoga in pulmonary hypertension, and most of the patients who were in the training group had demonstrated an improvement in the 6-minute walk test distance as compared to the controls. And the controls, when crossed over to the study group, again had shown improvement in the 6-minute walk test. So it does work, and it is very helpful in patients with pulmonary hypertension. Coming to the atrial septectomy, it's a very well-known procedure. It has been done widely. We create an interatrial communication. It decompresses the right atrium, increases the left ventricular preload, increases the cardiac output, and improves hemodynamics and symptoms. There are certain disadvantages, though. The desaturated blood reaches the coronaries as well as the cerebral vessels, and decompression is available only in diastole. Very high chances of the communication becoming small again. However, with the recent availability of atrial flow regulator, this disadvantage has been nullified. Coming to the next thing, what we can do for these patients is port shunt. So just to give you a brief, what we do with port shunt, the previously in the port shunt was done for patients with tetralogy of Fallot, but now what we're doing is a reverse port shunt. We are creating a communication between the left pulmonary artery and the descending aorta, and there is a decompression of the pulmonary artery into the descending aorta and improvement in the right heart function. It was first described in 2004 by Bartow et al. Again in NEJM, and their series was first published in 2012. It's a very interesting concept, decompresses the pulmonary circulation and maintains normal saturation to the brain and the coronaries. This is our own experience, and it's the largest single center experience in the world now, where we have 19 patients who have undergone surgical port shunt. Have undergone port shunt, 16 are surgical and 3 are transcatheter. All were in functional class 3 and 4, and 15 patients could be discharged home, and there were 2 late deaths. We have published this in Indian Heart Journal, and it has come out in March 2021. And if you see, this is one of the patients of echocardiogram of the patients of pre-port shunt. You can see the interventricular septum, which is bowing into the left ventricle. The RA is dilated, and this is at follow-up. You can see now the LV filling is much better. The interventricular septum is in the center, and the RV dilatation has come down. There is significant improvement in the NT-proBNP as well as the RV function after doing the port shunt, again in most of the patients, but not in all patients. And the survival of the patients, this is a cumulative survival of all our patients who were in functional class 3 or 4 at the time of counseling. And you can see the patients whom underwent, the green is underwent, those who consented to the port shunt and those who did not consent to the port shunt. There is a difference in the survival in these patients. So which are these patients which benefit from port shunt versus those who don't benefit from port shunt? We found that if the patient is older, has a lower right atrial pressure, has a higher cardiac index, and has a better right ventricular function, these patients do much better if we do port shunt. So what we concluded from our study is, if you do the port shunt, it can be done safely and effectively, first of all, in a developing country like India. Second is it has to be done at the earliest sign of right ventricular failure, and not once the patient is in frank right heart failure. Then the survival, short term as well as long term, is an issue with this procedure as well. So here again, there is an importance of doing risk stratification at baseline as well as at every follow-up, and keeping a record of what has happened previously is extremely important. And at the earliest sign where you feel that the patient is now, my patient now who was in low risk category is now progressing to intermediate or high risk category, that is the time when you should refer the patient or perform the port shunt in these patients. Once he has already reached the high risk category, then it is very difficult because then the procedure is high risk and the benefit is not so much. Lung and heart lung transplant, first carried out in 1981, has become a standard modality of care. However, amongst all causes for lung transplant, patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension have the worst survival. And we can see that the cost as well as availability in our country is again an issue with lung transplant. If time permits is okay, then I can discuss some cases, maybe 4 or 5 cases of pulmonary arterial hypertension. So one is a 16-year-old female, had got routine symptoms, easy fatigue and syncope, was diagnosed to have pulmonary arterial hypertension 4 years back, was started on pulmonary vasodilators, was on very high dose, tadalafil 40, ambrisentan 20, initially responded, but had gradual decrease in exercise capacity, was wheeled in a clinic. So what had happened on echocardiography, pulmonary hypertension was diagnosed, and the patient was labeled as idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension. Remaining all steps were kind of missed. On further inquiry, the patient had small joint pain, Raynaud's phenomenon, ANA-DSNA was positive. She was diagnosed as SLE with pulmonary hypertension, started on immunosuppression therapy. After 3 weeks after starting the immunosuppression, she walked into our clinic. 6 minute walk. So somebody who was brought into the clinic on a wheelchair could now do a 6-minute walk test, and she walked 200 meters. We later lost this patient, I think 3 years down the line, we lost this patient to progressive right heart failure. So this patient actually had connective tissue disease, pulmonary hypertension, and was wrongly labeled as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. This is another one, 18-year-old female, symptomatic since last 2.5 years, was diagnosed and treated for pulmonary hypertension for 2 years. There was marginal response to pulmonary vasodilator. Again, PH was diagnosed on echocardiogram and was labeled as idiopathic. And this is the VQ scan. And you can see there is a significant perfusion defects in this patient. A CT scan was repeated, and you can see the large clot which is there. This patient was further diagnosed to have factor V leading deficiency. She underwent endarterectomy. These are the clots which have been removed from her lungs. Had a mean PA pressure of 22 millimeters of mercury at discharge. She is now on follow for more than 1 year and continues to be on function class 2. And she is only on oral anticoagulation, not on any pulmonary vasodilator. So a cause of pulmonary hypertension, thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, can be treated if we evaluate the patient according to the guidelines. Okay. Next, cases 3 and 4, young ladies in their mid-20s diagnosed to have large ASD with moderate to severe pulmonary hypertension, underwent ASD closure, was brought back with severe pulmonary hypertension. Both of them were brought back with severe pulmonary hypertension. Again, an ASD was found and was labeled as a cause of pulmonary hypertension. ASD usually does not cause pulmonary hypertension. And this patient, on further inquiry, had history of small joint pain and Redon phenomenon. Again, ASLE was diagnosed in one patient, and mixed connective tissue disorder in another patient. Was started on steroids and hydroxychloroquine and methotrexate. Slowly weaned off BiPAP and sent home. And on follow-up, the patient could walk 6-minute walk test. So a patient who is in function class 4 was able to, we were able to discharge, as well as improvement in the functional class, as well as 6-minute walk test was demonstrated.
Dr. Prashant,
go ahead.
Dr. Prashant, can I interrupt?
Yes.
Can we discuss some of these cases, because there will be some question and answer session, and then we can have good, your corroboration with your cases as well during those question and answer session.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just go to the conclusion part of it.
Yes.
Okay.
So
this is an important message. Fever is not a sign of ceftriaxone deficiency. Similarly, pulmonary hypertension is not a sign of sildenafil deficiency. And to conclude, thorough evaluation of patients with pulmonary hypertension is essential prior to initiation of therapy. Patient risk stratification and individualized therapy is extremely important. Prostacyclins are definitely the need of the hour, and innovative treatment strategies like port shunts need to be considered. Thank you.
thank you very much. Dear friends, am I audible again? Yes. Masterly presentation. Dr. Prashant, I'm really so happy that you presented this very difficult topic very elegantly. And especially I'm happy because you have personal experience. I mean, you showed your cases, and then you started with right from definition, the old definition, the revised definition, then the diagnostic method, then risk stratification, treatment, and your personal experience. Really masterly presentation. And I think we will again come back during question and answer session where you can offer your comments also, and we have good panelists also. Now let us go to the next part of our discussion, that is second presentation, which will be done by Dr. Mahavir Modi. I mean, as I said, that expert in ILD and expert in COPD. Dr. Modi, to be very honest with you, I understand very little about pulmonology, because we have, being in corporate hospital, we have liberty to refer our cases to the pulmonologist, and rather than splitting our gray cells on different parts of different diagnostic aspects of pulmonology, we just ask our pulmonologist to do with it. So I think today I will just do the same thing. I'll just keep my brain aside, and then I will I patiently listen to you, what you are telling. So dear delegates, we are going to have another excellent presentation by this master on pulmonology, and that is Dr. Mahavir Modi from Pune. And Dr. Mahavir, please, the stage is for you. You can proceed and start your slide sharing.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you MSN for inviting me here. And excellent presentation, Dr. Prashant. Dr. Prashant just helped me in one of our patient in the first wave of this COVID. So this was a young female who was pregnant, and during pregnancy, pulmonary hypertension was found, and we were not able to ship the patient to Mumbai because of this lockdown, and plus because she was a very high risk for travel. But we have made the Selexipag also available through Dr. Prashant. So thank you very much, sir. And now I think I'm looking forward for MSN to get these molecules in India, and we'll be able to use in our needy patients. So most of the talk, I think what Dr. Prashant sir has given, it is going to be the repetitive in my presentation also. I have almost similar kind of data what sir has shown. So I mean, we won't go in the details, but there will be some of the repetitions. As we said, we discussed that pulmonary arterial hypertension, it's a rare form of pulmonary hypertension that affects the small pulmonary arteries, which are less than 50 microns in diameter. And they are characterized by obliterative vasculopathy of the distal pulmonary arterial circulation and can lead to right ventricular failure and death. The definition, we all know that it was 25 millimeters of mercury before, and then now it is the pulmonary artery pressure which is more than 20 millimeters of mercury, and the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure less than 15, and pulmonary vascular resistance more than 3 Woods unit in the absence of pulmonary parenchymal or thromboembolic disease. So the stats, what are the facts and the prevalence is? Estimated incidence is around 7.6 cases per million adults, and prevalence is up to 26 to 100 per million adults. Of course, the incidence and prevalence differs from the each and every state as well as to the field of our respiratory medicine, because we are seeing a lot of patients, especially with secondary pulmonary hypertension, the patients of COPD with interstitial lung disease. Then we get a lot of patients with CTD, ILD, and then coming to us as pulmonary hypertension. So the incidence and prevalence, I feel that it differs from institute to institute and plus on the practicing physician also. What is important is the prognosis of all these patients. The median survival for patients diagnosed with pulmonary arterial hypertension has been reported to be 2.8 years from the time of diagnosis. And if you see the 7-year survival rate, from the time of diagnosis, each year, the survival rate goes on declining, and 5-year survival in the PHC registry was 58% and 3-year survival was 67%. So definitely we have an unacceptable 7-year survival rate, and clinical progression continues to occur despite improvement in the 1-year survival. Now coming to the classification about pulmonary hypertension, and that is where role of pulmonologist comes into play, because if you see there are 5 more broad categories of this pulmonary hypertension. The group 1 is the pulmonary arterial hypertension, which I think we are all basically discussed in Dr. Prashant sir's talk, because this is where all your pulmonary vasodilators are going to be basically useful. So these are the patients where they can have idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension, they can be heritable, it can be drug and toxin induced, or it can be because of with patients with HIV, with portopulmonary hypertension, connective tissue disease, congenital heart disease, schistosomiasis, and we have patients with pulmonary veno-occlusive disease and pulmonary capillary hemangiomatosis. Also, there is a persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn. So they all come into category 1, that is the pulmonary arterial hypertension. Then the group 2 is the patient, those who are having pulmonary hypertension due to left heart disease, and they are basically because of the left heart failure, maybe with preserved or with depressed left ventricular ejection fraction. They may have valvular heart disease like patients with mitral stenosis, and then there are patients with congenital or acquired cardiovascular conditions leading to post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. Then we have the group 3, which is basically for the pulmonologist, and these are the patients where we have obstructive or the restrictive or the mixed kind of lung diseases, which can give rise to secondary pulmonary hypertension. So in this, we have patients with COPD, we have patients with interstitial lung disease, then we have now patients with this post-COVID fibrosis and developing pulmonary hypertension. So we have, patients where the chronic respiratory condition giving rise to secondary pulmonary hypertension. We also have patients in this group, those who are hypoxic but without any lung disease, and there are patients with developmental lung disorders. So there may be patients with this Pickwickian syndrome, or then there are patients with central hypoventilation syndrome. So these are all the patients where they will be hypoxic, hypercarbic, and then having pulmonary hypertension because of this is the group 3 patients. Group 4 patients are because of the chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. Again, we are getting many patients, and unless we do VQ scan and we try to find out if the patient has thromboembolic phenomena, because these are the conditions where we can offer them a good treatment by doing a surgical thromboendarterectomy, or if not surgical, arterectomy, but we can at least do even the balloon angioplasty for these patients. And then we have group 5 patients where we don't have the exact mechanism, and they can be the combination of any of these patients. So they can be hematologic disorders like chronic hemolytic anemia, myeloproliferative disorders. Again, HIV comes into this particular category because there can be multiple mechanisms by which the HIV can cause pulmonary hypertension. Then we have patients with fibrosing mediastinitis, chronic renal failure, and pulmonary tumors. So these are the patients which we can get into this group 5. So this is how the broad category, and this is always our main intention is to find out what is the etiology. And once we know what is the cause for pulmonary hypertension, Dr. Prashant sir has given a very beautiful illustration about what all investigation needs to be done in these patients. Just a brief about, we should know that whenever we get a patient and we label these patients as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension, before that we should know certain drugs which can give rise to this pulmonary hypertension. And there are definite drugs, there are probable drugs. So definite are basically the drugs which are basically used for decreasing the appetite, and these are aminorex, fenfluramine, dexfenfluramine, mefentamines, dosatinib, and toxic rapeseed oil. Whereas there are other drugs which can cause, possibly they can cause pulmonary hypertension. In this we have drugs which are used like leflunomide. We have drugs which are active against hepatitis C. The interferons, now we have interferons coming into play even for the COVID treatment, and we have regulated interferon 2B. So I mean, there are various drugs which we have not used very commonly, but these are the drugs which can have possible pulmonary hypertension. We have discussed about this, how do we classify these patients by doing a pulmonary, acute pulmonary vasoreactivity test, and I won't go into details because Dr. Prashant sir has discussed about it. This is something which is very important for a clinician's point of view, that how do you, we were just discussing and we have discussed about how do you know about the functional class has come from grade 1 to grade 2 or grade 2 to grade 1, but how do we divide these patients? So this is basically because whatever classification I just talked to you now, that is based upon the etiology, but we should have a functional classification, and this is WHO functional classification, or in this we can have a NYHA functional class which was adopted by WHO to facilitate the evaluation of patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension. And there are 4 groups, class 1, 2, 3, 4, and there are basically 4 symptoms what we like to ask to these patients, whether patients have dyspnea or fatigue, chest pain, and near syncope. So these are all 4 cardinal features of patients with pulmonary hypertension. So in class 1, these patients do not have any limitation in the physical activity, and ordinary physical activity does not cause any of these symptoms. In class 2, these patients are comfortable at rest, but ordinary physical activity can give rise to these symptoms. In class 3, these patients are again comfortable at rest, but even less than ordinary physical activity like combing or like brushing, even that can give rise to breathlessness. And in class 4, so these are the patients, those who will be even breathless even at rest. So they will be unable to carry out any kind of physical activity without symptoms. So that is how you can come to know which functional class is your patient. Now about what are the patients who can have risk of developing pulmonary arterial hypertension. So there are patients where we have patients with known genetic mutations, so 20% chance of developing PH. First degree relatives of a patient with a familial pulmonary hypertension, 10% chance of developing. Then in scleroderma patients, almost the incidence is 27% of prevalence of pulmonary arterial hypertension. And then in patients with, nowadays we get patients for fitness for liver transplant. And if these patients have portal hypertension, we can see almost 5% of patients, they have portopulmonary hypertension. Then we have patients with congenital heart disease. And then we have patients, those who are on fenfluramine for the appetite suppressant, and they have used for more than 3 months. You see that almost 23 times the chance of developing pulmonary hypertension. In HIV and sickle cell disease also. So these are all patients where they have risk of developing pulmonary artery hypertension. This is again what we have discussed by the Revell score, and to stratify the patient, how much is the risk, the low risk, depending upon the score, if it is less than 8. And in the score, we have these multiple factors. So we can calculate as per whether the patient is in WHO group 1, then based upon the demographics, whether patient has renal insufficiency. There are multiple factors you can see on the screen, and based upon this, and add a score of 6 into this, and then that will give you a risk score. And based upon this risk score, so how much is the score that Revell? If it is less than 8, then the patient has low risk, less than 5%. If the score is between 8 to 9, then there are intermediate risk of 5 to 10%. and high risk of more than 10% if the score is more than 10. So this calculated risk range from 0, which is the lowest risk, to the more than 10, which is a higher risk. Now about the diagnosis, we have discussed about what are the clinical features. So most of the times, certain clinical features what we should not miss. One is that most of the time these patients may have right heart failure, because of which they have peripheral edema, they may have hepatomegaly, they may have JVP distension, they may have ascites. But only pulmonary hypertension, these patients may have a typical diastolic shock or a palpable second heart sound. They may have a left parasternal heave. They may have a pansystolic murmur of tricuspid regurg, and they may have a Graham-Steele murmur of pulmonary insufficiency, which can be a diastolic murmur or a mid-diastolic murmur. So based upon this, once you should have the patient's history, the physical examination, screening procedures, and after that, to find out if the patient has pulmonary hypertension, we do ECG. Then there are certain signs on chest X-ray which are very difficult to interpret, but the patient, those who are having very high or severe pulmonary hypertension, their X-ray can be of definite use for diagnosing pulmonary hypertension. Now, of course, the right heart failure also you can find out by looking at the right heart cardiomegaly on the X-ray. Doppler echocardiography. After this, to know which class your patients are into, one should always, as a pulmonologist, I will like to get my patient's lung function test done along with a diffusion study. So these patients where we can find out if the patient has interstitial lung disease. We also VQ scan to find out chronic pulmonary thromboembolism, and a very good quality. It is very important to have a very good quality high resolution CT scan, because just like Dr. Prashant sir was saying that he gets patients those who are undiagnosed and they are labeled as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. Similarly, as a pulmonologist, I get patients where the patient's CT scan has been done randomly and these patients are labeled as absolutely no lung parenchymal disease. But if you do a very good quality high resolution CT scan by doing the prone as well as supine images, you take an inspiratory as well as the expiratory HRCT images, and then you can find out that some of these patients actually may have some kind of interstitial lung disease. So there may be bronchiolitis, there can be a rheumatoid, and with rheumatoid there can be bronchiolitis, or with some kind of connective tissue disease like SLE there can be some bronchiolitis. So these are the patients, obstructive bronchiolitis, obliterative bronchiolitis, or there can be some exposure to toxins, chemicals, hypersensitive pneumonitis. So all these patients, they can be picked up by doing a very good quality HRCT. So although in the management for pulmonary hypertension from pulmonology perspective, there may not be much in addition to whatever sir said, but one takeaway from my talk is that we need a very good HRCT before labeling a patient as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. And then blood test and immunology, we should do HIV test, we should do a 6-minute walk test, and then of course the right heart catheterization. Again, this is a flow chart which we just discussed, and if we have a patient where you suspect pulmonary hypertension on echocardiogram, you see a left heart disease, then you have to treat first the left heart disease. If the left heart is normal, then you can go for this armamentarium test, what we discussed, ECG, PFT, chest imaging, VQ scan. One more very important study for doing before labeling a patient as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension, and they're coming to my clinic, this is a patient with sleep apnea. So sleep apnea, obese patient with a snoring and daytime sleepiness, daytime hypercarbia or early morning hypercarbia. These patients are the ones, those who can develop because of obstructive sleep apnea giving rise to pulmonary hypertension. So always think about a treatable cause like obstructive sleep apnea, and if patient is for chronic pulmonary embolism, initiate workup for CTPH. And if there is a no reversible cause, then we should go for a right heart catheter. And if there's a pre-capillary pulmonary hypertension, do a vasodilator challenge test. If there's a post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, treat the heart disease. And if the pre-capillary pulmonary hypertension and vasodilator challenge is negative, then proceed to treatment algorithm. And if it is positive, consider high-dose calcium channel blocker, which we have just discussed in our previous talk. So again, there are some specific tests which we should be doing. As I said, high-resolution CT scan. And then for patients, once you know that these patients have interstitial lung disease, again, many of the times in the pulmonology practice, once the patient is diagnosed as interstitial lung disease, it has been labeled that this patient has idiopathic interstitial lung disease or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. But again, ILD is a very, very vast topic, and before labeling a patient that he has idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, because once we label the patient as IPF, the survival is only 3 to 5 years, whereas if these patients, although they have a end-stage lung disease on the scan, and if they are and if we find out that they have some underlying connective tissue disease, the prognosis significantly improves. Okay, and then we have multiple drugs to offer to these patients. So always try to rule out, even if we have an interstitial lung disease with pulmonary hypertension, try to rule out by doing all these anti-DS, GNA, rheumatoid factor, then the anti-centromere antibody, anti-SL70 antibody. So all those tests to find out if the patient has underlying connective tissue disease. Then we have patients for chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. So in these patients, one more diagnostic test what we all should be doing is a thrombophilia screen. So just Dr. Prashant sir also showed us case where the case where the patients underwent surgery, thromboendarterectomy was done, and that patient had factor V Leiden deficiency. So same way we should be always screening these patients for protein C, protein S deficiency, antithrombin 3, lupus anticoagulant, APLA antibody, and factor V Leiden mutation. And imaging for these patients is Doppler ultrasound of the pelvic and femoral veins, which is very important because we do normally Doppler only for the lower limb veins, and if there is no DVT found, but still these patients they can have DVT in the pelvic veins or in the femoral veins. VQ scan, CT pulmonary angiography, and invasive pulmonary angiography also can be done for these patients to find out if they have chronic pulmonary thromboembolism. One more test which we are not doing very routinely, but I will like to mention about is the cardiac magnetic resonance imaging or the cardiac MR, CMR. So these patients, so CMR can be used to predict the mean pulmonary artery pressure, cardiac output, wedge pressure, and pulmonary vascular resistance with accuracy. The role of CMR in the prognostication of PAH is better established. A recent meta-analysis has shown RV ejection fraction to be a strong predictor of mortality along with the RV volumes. So whenever possible, try to take help of a MRI because it's a non-invasive test. Now about the management, we have discussed about almost all kinds of drugs and the pathways which are available. Some general principles is first is we should ask the patient to avoid pregnancy, just like we discussed one case where this patient, she came in pregnancy and then was found to have pulmonary hypertension, but otherwise you ask the patient to avoid pregnancy. Influenza and pneumococcal vaccines from the pulmonology perspective, again annual influenza vaccine for all these patients and pneumococcal vaccine once in 5 years, and if the patient is more than 65 years of age group, which is rarely in these patients, but still in those patients only once pneumococcal vaccine. Psychological support is very important. Supervise exercise training and avoid excessive physical activity that leads to distressing symptoms. Carefully titrated diuretics to reduce the fluid overload. This is again very important in pulmonology because many of our patients, they have edema, they have cor pulmonale, and then because of this, these patients will have a very disturbed sleep, and so we try to give them some small amount of diuretics along with the whatever medications we have as pulmonary vasodilators. Most important from the class 3 patients, because none of the pulmonary vasodilators actually have shown any mortality benefit when you are using to treat pulmonary hypertension along with your COPD or in patients with ILD. What is required for these patients is the mechanism of pulmonary hypertension in all our chronic respiratory patients is because of the chronic hypoxia. And for the simple reason, we have to always keep the PaO2 of more than 60 or saturation of more than 88 to 90%. And these are the patients where we give them long-term oxygen therapy. And when we say long-term oxygen therapy, that means that it is not to be taken as an SOS basis, because I still get a lot of patients or the doctors advising them not to use oxygen therapy for a long term. But for all our chronic respiratory patients, whenever these patients are hypoxic and having pulmonary hypertension, the best medicine for these patients is long-term oxygen therapy. We advise almost 12 to 14 hours of oxygen per day, and that is a graded oxygen therapy, so only 1 to 2 liters of oxygen to keep the saturations barely 90%. We don't want 95-100% saturations, otherwise it can cause more CO2 retention in these patients. So graded oxygen therapy, 12 to 14 hours, and these 12 to 14 hours, we ask the patients to take it overnight, 6 to 7 hours, maybe in the daytime when they sleep for around 1 or 2 hours, and then in spurts, whenever they, after some activity like after bath, after puja, after going to the market, so whenever they feel breathless, that time they can take in spurts for half an hour to 1 hour. So, I mean, the total of all this, it goes around 12 to 14 hours of oxygen for all our pulmonology patients. Avoid GA and use epidural instead if feasible. So this is what we discussed, and I think we won't go again in the details, but there are three basic pathways: endothelin pathway, nitric oxide pathway, and the prostacyclin pathway. We have discussed about this, and there are multiple drugs which are available, and I'm happy that Selexipag will be available by MSN because it's a prostacyclin analog, and the dose is 200 to 1600 micrograms twice a day. We are using it currently in one patient where we have got it from with a special approval from abroad. And then we have endothelin receptor antagonists like bosentan, ambrisentan, macitentan, and nitric oxide pathway analogs, that is sildenafil, tadalafil, and then the riociguat. So these are definitely the different drugs which are available. And I think this is again the same repetition because we have less time. So I won't go into the treatment part in the detail, because if the patient has low risk, we can start with the monotherapy. Then now we have evidence saying that in the even if the patient has functional class grade 2, then we can, instead of giving monotherapy, add these patients by giving a dual therapy and then the triple therapy, and then we can have in the high group, high risk patients, we have parenteral prostacyclin, and then we can refer these patients for lung transplantation. So these are the this is again very important topic, important slide, because this is something what we have not discussed. How do you ask your patients for the adherence to the pH specific therapy? And because there are a lot of social and economic factors, the patients are normally not literate, and we don't know, many of the doctors also are not aware about the pulmonary hypertension. The cost of the medications is very high. There is lack of insurance coverage, unstable living conditions, low income or unemployment, lack of social support. Patient-related factors, they can be the patients have forgetfulness, they don't have knowledge about this particular disease, and they have a lack of perception of the disease also, and cultural beliefs, and a lot of other factors because of which the therapy is also very complex. The long duration of therapy, the patient never gets cured out of this pulmonary hypertension, and they keep on lifelong treatment for this. So these are the reasons why the patient may not be very much adherent to the pH therapy. Now we have patients, those who are even after giving the full medical therapy, still these patients are can be refractory to the medical therapy, and transplantation for pH is a relatively rare indication. Only around 5% of all lung transplants is appropriate. When the patient's predicted 2 to 3 year survival is estimated to be less than 50%. Perioperative risk is minimized with early referrals before severe cardiac dysfunction and hepatic congestion develop. So this is also very important when to refer your patient. If you refer when the cardiac function as well as the hepatic function is abnormal, then they may not be the right candidate for the transplant. And widely accepted criteria for referral for transplant evaluation are WHO functional class 3 or 4, despite maximum medical therapy, markedly low 6-minute walk distance, cardiac index of less than 2, and CVP of more than 15. Now these are the novel treatment options targeting specific pathway. There are a lot of new medicines which are coming into market for this pulmonary hypertension, but I think some of them are spironolactone, residotril, fluoxetine, tocilizumab, metformin, and these are different drugs which are there, and maybe there are a lot of different trials which are going on for these particular drugs, and we'll be very happy if we get more and more drugs, especially the cheaper drugs, if they come into place. So to summarize, continually reassessing WHO group 1 pulmonary hypertension versus other group WHO group pulmonary hypertension risk and management remains important to patient-centered care. So we should always try to get the etiology by fixing into one of the categories. Monotherapy may be appropriate for some, especially in the class 1 patients. Patients should be counseled that pH-specific therapies oftentimes do not immediately improve symptoms or functional status and make weeks or months for the improvement. Oxygen, diuretics, and other supportive therapies remain important in reaching the low-risk status. Vasoreactivity should always be assessed when appropriate, that is idiopathic, familial, or drug toxin-induced pulmonary hypertension, and CCB therapy remains initiated as indicated. A more convenient therapy does not always equate to improved tolerability. Side effects of one medication within a drug class may not be as frequent or severe with the another medication within the same therapeutic class. For example, we get a lot of hepatotoxicity with the bosentan, but not with the newer agents like ambrisentan and macitentan. Connective tissue disease patients often have overlapping ILD. Use extra caution and monitor closely for side effects and deterioration with the vasodilators, because what happens that these patients have decreased ventilation also, and by giving vasodilators, you can actually mismatch their ventilation perfusion balance, and these ILD patients should never be given only vasodilators, but we have to always treat the underlying cause by giving antifibrotics, by giving oxygen, by giving steroids or some immunosuppressants. So that is the mainstay of therapy for treating pulmonary hypertension in our pulmonology practice. Toxin-induced patients, particularly those currently using methamphetamines, may struggle with medication compliance and adherence, and initiation of medication requirements need to be carefully considered, particularly in women of childbearing potential and the ability to reliably perform monthly pregnancy testing. So I think this was the last one. Thank you so much.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Modi, really masterly, very good presentation indeed. And then especially we cardiologists being dependent on you, I mean, as a faculty. So I think it was really good, educative. I think, in fact, for me also, for a cardiologist, it was very educative. And all the delegates who are present, they will also agree that it was excellent presentation. And you have quite differences. I mean, from a cardiologist perspective versus your pulmonologist perspective. I mean, this etiology is different. The vasodilators are not so common, but then instead you have to go into the details of the underlying pulmonary etiology and connective tissue disorders and so on and so forth. Really good presentation. I would just let Dr. Nitin Chaturvedi to introduce our two brilliant panelists. I mean, we have very good panelists as well for question answer session. And it was intended to be 1.5 hours, but then I think we can extend a little bit because I think it's a very interesting topic and people are also asking. There are almost 20 questions in the chat box. So I think many people are, still inquisitive and they want to know more and more. So quickly, if you can introduce two brilliant panelists and then we'll go to question answer. Nitin, can you introduce?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, sir. We have got first panelist, that is Dr. Ashif Rahim, who is a senior consultant and intervention cardiologist in Divine Heart Institute, Surat. And Dr. Ashif has achieved many awards during his course of education, that is best outgoing student. And he has achieved the Al-Amin Award for academic excellence. In 2014, he pursued fellowship from Society of Cardiovascular Angiography and Intervention and Washington, USA, and European Society of Cardiology. He presented the Edolimus registry in EuroPCR, and he published various national and international publications and journals, that is EuroPCR Journal and Indian Heart Journal. Then we have got the second panelist for the today's session, that is, we have got Dr. Gopal Rawal, who is a consultant pulmonologist and critical care specialist, sleep disorder specialist at Ahmedabad. And Dr. Gopal, he was a secretary in Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine at Ahmedabad. He pursued fellowship in sleep medicine by ISDA. He was council member in Indian Sleep Disorder Association. He attended as a faculty of fundamental critical care support conducted by Society of Critical Care Medicines, that is SCCM, USA. He was ex-regional faculty of Asia Pacific country for BLS ACLS course by ASJ. And Dr. Gopal was teacher for DNB by National Board of Sterling Hospital, Ahmedabad. And he secured International Board Certificate in Sleep Medicines, that is IBSL. So this is brief introduction about our two panelists for the session, sir.
Thank you very much, Nitin, for introducing two great panelists. Now let us come to our question answer session. There are almost 20 questions. So let us go one by one, and some of them there is repetition, so maybe we can couple them together. The very first question was, what are the do's and don'ts? What are the precautions that you will tell the the pulmonary arterial hypertension patient? Like, for example, I remember I'm talking about, way back in early 1980s, when we didn't have even contrast echo was also not there. 2D echo had just come in. And at that time, sometimes for pulmonary hypertension, we used to do angiography. And then during angiography with those viscous dyes, we did not have even good contrast media. And then we used to have some on-table deaths. So we knew that, all right, if it is severe PH, always beware, don't go for angiography. Or don't tell them that don't run over the staircase, otherwise they will drop dead. So that is the old, I think, precaution that we used to take in 1980s. Now, our current young panelist, they can, Dr. Asif or Dr. Dr. Rawal, can you being intensivist and intensive critical care specialist, you can definitely guide the audience, and then of course our speakers also can guide subsequently. Do's and don'ts in that you will tell your patient that, because that is what relatives ask, what he should not do. So, Asif?
Yes, sir. It was a very excellent talk by both the speakers, covering almost everything. The ground reality is a little different compared to what we have seen. Most of the patients which we get are usually from the lower financial group of the patient, at least in this part of the place where we practice. And then when we get a lot of patients, it's just not practical for us to do vasoreactivity tests in most of the patients. Of course, we would be able to rule out most of the connective tissue disorders, and maybe non-invasive tests can be used to rule out pulmonary embolism like pitches. But then once when we have these patients, I just had a question for Dr. Prashant just to find out. I'll be coming to the points which you would be telling, sir. You were asking. Is it possible that without doing a vasoreactive test, and since we know only 10% of these patients on vasoreactive, can we use calcium channel blockers? And then how long do we need to wait to understand without doing a vasoreactive test?
So without doing a vasoreactive test, we should never start on calcium channel blockers, because the problem with calcium channel blockers is they're systemic vasodilators as well. And if we give it in patients who are non-responsive to inhaled nitric oxide or adenosine in the cath lab, these patients can have sudden hypotension and sudden death. So without a cardiac catheterization, we should never prescribe calcium channel blockers.
So because as cardiologists, we've been using diltiazem and amlodipine quite frequently in a lot of patients. And then can we, as you say, that we shouldn't start because of hypotension. But if they are able to tolerate hypotension up to a certain extent, like 5 milligrams or 90 milligrams of diltiazem.
Unless you have a patient, the calcium channel blockers which are required to be used in pulmonary hypertension are high doses. You really require to go to very high doses of either diltiazem or nifedipine for the patient to benefit. And hence, we would never do it without vasoreactive testing. So if you're not able to do a vasoreactive testing, it is safer to start on phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor or endothelin receptor antagonist.
Okay. Regarding the do's and don'ts for the patients, most of the times we start off with the diet, where a salt-restricted diet would be required. Diuretics need to be used cautiously, because then again, filling pressure is also required for the forward output. And in the use of sildenafil, when we are using sildenafil, most of the times these patients would have gone to some other doctors, and these doctors would have used nitrates. So we need to be very careful to tell these patients not to combine these two medications, or else they would have issues. And with ambrisentan, we've seen less of liver toxicity, but patients initially, patients who were on bosentan, a periodic LFT was required. Having said about all these things about the advanced therapy, one very important thing which comes to my mind is most of these patients are anemic. Correction of the anemia is very important before we start thinking of this pH specific therapy. And a pregnancy which has been strongly recommended not to go for pregnancy. But sometimes we do get patients who are pregnant, as you had a case of pregnancy. And in such cases, I just wanted to know, what if the patients come with pregnancy? When they come to me, I tell them, if they come within the legal thing, and I try to discourage pregnancy, and even if it requires a termination. But if a patient comes to us past the 20 weeks or 24 week stage, how do we manage those cases, Dr. Prashant?
So we have had now delivered 6 patients with pulmonary hypertension. So the problem here is twofold. You're going to war with your hands tied behind your back, because we have to withhold your endothelin receptor antagonists in these patients, because they are known to be teratogenic. So the only medications which we have, which are available in India, are phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors. And pH is known to worsen during pregnancy, especially because of the hormonal changes. During the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, there is significant worsening, and if that is not happening post-delivery, they have another severe deterioration because of the fluid overload and fluid changes which happen during pregnancy. So what we have done in our 6 patients is, if they are affording, we try to start them on prostacyclin analogs, or else after the first 20 weeks are over, then we start them on when they first come in. If they don't want to do an abortion, we have to stop ambrisentan and restart ambrisentan maybe after 21 or 22 weeks when the organogenesis is complete. Follow them up very regularly by doing a 6-minute walk test and an NT-proBNP, maybe every monthly for the first trimester and the second trimester. In the third trimester, you decrease the duration to every 15 days. Get the patient in the hospital at around 37 to 38 weeks if you can carry till term. And try to do an elective lower section cesarean section because these patients will not be able to tolerate the normal delivery. We use epidural anesthesia. We also have put a neckline for continuous PA pressures monitoring. We keep nitric oxide standby and monitor this. And once the delivery is done, shift the patient to the ICU. And in addition, we restart all the medications for this patient. And in addition to the other things, what needs to be taken care of is one is the diuretics. Second is the care for DVT and anticoagulation because it is known to increase the chances of thromboembolism. And by doing this meticulously, we are able to deliver six patients now with pulmonary hypertension successfully.
Okay, and in spite of doing all this, can we expect a mortality rate around pregnancy of about?
Yes. So the mortality rate is what has been described in textbooks is 30%. By the previous studies, it is improving with the kind of medications which we have. Touchwood, till now we didn't have a mortality as yet, but maybe in India we still would say that there is 30% mortality.
Yes. Another question. Yes, please, Dr. Modi.
Yeah. After delivery, do you feel that the PA pressures come down drastically?
No. So actually, PA pressures don't come down drastically. These patients, in fact, the day 3 to day 7 are the ones which is the most high risk for these patients. You see rise in PA pressures, rise in NT-proBNP, and these patients kind of almost crash. So after delivery, the first 7 to 10 days are extremely crucial. PA pressures don't drop after pregnancy, especially if it is pulmonary arterial hypertension.
Yes, there is another question. I think next question will proceed to the next question. Dr. Rawal, there were quite a few people have asked about COPD and then pulmonary hypertension. That how do you treat it? Look at it differently than a cardiologist. Like we have so many vasodilators and then 3 pathways and which we talked about. But then about oxygen, about vaccine, about selection of still our vasodilators, 3 pathway dilators. How do you look at it differently and how do you treat it? I think there are almost 3 people have asked the same question. And then regarding sildenafil, tadalafil also in the same, I can put it as a sub question for this respiratory etiology pulmonary hypertension, that is group 3, WHO group 3. They are talking about that. Do you use it? And then do you score? Do you have anything in preference between this tadalafil versus sildenafil? How do you choose the between the two? Dr. Rawal, and then again, we can come back to this thing, Dr. Modi also.
First of all, thanks to MSN for organizing this beautiful that clinical feast on a pulmonary hypertension by that Dr. Karnik sir and with Dr. Prashant and my friend Dr. Mahavir. Excellent talk, both of speakers that given. To just go on a COPD, that is a group 3 pulmonary hypertension. Generally, we used to treat the what is the cause behind the pulmonary hypertension. Just as Dr. Mahavir has mentioned in his talk, that mostly the group 3, that is the hypoxemia, which is hypoxic vasoconstriction, which is responsible for the pulmonary hypertension. So to treat, to keep the oxygen level more than 88 to 92%, and this COPD patient, they have some sort of core pulmonary features also to keep the adequate balance, that using the diuretics. And we have to be very careful for using this sildenafil and the calcium channel blocker. As Dr. Prashant has mentioned, there is a chance of hypotension is also there, and COPD has a syndromic presentation, so they may have underlying cardiology backup also. So we prior using that sildenafil, they should not be on a nitrates also, because sometimes that that without seeing the other prescription, the patient, or sometimes patient is taking the nitrates and you are not look at his prescription and prescribing the sildenafil, that would be a very risky to the patient. So as per my side, that what I manage the COPD patient with the pulmonary hypertension to just keep the oxygen level upgrade, and sometimes with careful, if the patient doesn't have any cardiac comorbid conditions, then we can give the low dose of tadalafil. I am comfortable with that vasodilator tadalafil.
Dr. Modi, do you have to add something to what Dr. Rawal had said?
No, absolutely. Even we basically have to manage the oxygen levels and to prevent the pulmonary vasoconstriction by keeping the oxygen levels good. Now we are tempted to use sildenafil, tadalafil. Even I prefer tadalafil over sildenafil because of the once a daily dosing, and plus only thing is now there are no studies to show any improvement in the mortality when you are using in these patients, but definitely there is some symptomatic benefit in COPD as well as in ILD patients, especially if they have severe pulmonary hypertension. So there are no, and we have to carefully monitor these patients because sometimes there can be worsening of this hypoxemia or worsening of the dyspnea in these patients, and so those kind of patients we have to almost select. And one more addition in these patients is sometimes if they are not able to manage only the hypoxemia part by oxygen levels, and if these patients are really hypercarbic, we even try to give home BiPAP to many of these patients for the removal of CO2. Okay, so removing CO2 as well as managing the hypoxemia part, both the things will take care of the lung part as such. Okay, and then preventing the progressive pulmonary hypertension.
Thank you, Dr.
Sir, I have one question.
Yes.
Sir, nowadays that we have seen in a post-COVID patient that they have a high pulmonary vasculopathy. So somewhere that I have seen that some are preferring. What is your that view of the endothelin receptor that particularly using these drugs in a post-COVID pulmonary hypertension?
Yes, very important point that you have raised. Actually, it's not high endothelin level which produces hypertension in this post-COVID status, but these people have endothelialitis. And as a result of endothelialitis, they have de novo thrombus formation in the pulmonary vasculature, and which can produce again something akin to our class group 4, WHO group 4, that it's not thromboembolic, but it is de novo thrombus formation in the pulmonary vasculature producing this pulmonary hypertension. But nevertheless, because if it is occurring in the small vasculature, still we have large vasculature at large for our vasodilators to work. Because if you see the pulmonary artery diameter and area, that is just 4 square centimeter. As opposed to that, as you go more and more distally to this 100 micron and then, smaller and smaller arterioles, that entire vascular area becomes almost 100 square centimeter. So when you have endothelialitis, like whether it is post-COVID or in the older days, schistosomiasis, what Magdi Yakub had, initially described in his presentation last year. So all those are small vasculature occlusions, and in which you have large area still which can respond to your vasodilators. And then, so vasodilators will be useful. And plus your, of course, apixaban or this thing non-vitamin K antagonist, which will prevent further progressive thrombosis, because endothelialitis being the primary cause of that vascular occlusion, we can have better progression of the disease can be prevented, and already the existing disease can be ameliorated by proper vasodilatation in the pulmonary vasculature. Anything else that you anybody want to add from the panelist side about this post-COVID status?
We would be expecting a lot of cases coming in the future, and it is something like almost like chronic thromboembolic episode, the CTPH like thing. And even if you see the one of the guidelines, they have allowed Riociguat to be used. So something maybe prostaglandins and the other vasodilators like sildenafil and endothelin receptor blockers should definitely help in such cases.
Yeah.
But when
Now, Dr. Asif, very good thing. Since you have come at riociguat, there are one or two questions about riociguat. Now, classically, it was initially, it came in the literature for this CTPH and this, and but then truly it being a vasodilator, basically through cyclic GMP, that in can we use it in other groups, group 1, group 2 of group 2, group 3 of pulmonary arterial hypertension? That is a question asked by somebody. In fact, it has been approved for the WHO group 1 also. So I would like the comments from the panelists about riociguat use in, apart from CTPH, the other parts of pulmonary hypertension. Dr. Prashant or Dr. Modi? Dr. Prashant?
So there is a study which is called as a REPLACE study, which has shown that in patients who are not doing well on sildenafil or tadalafil, if you replace them with riociguat, then the response is better. However, our personal experience is not the same. There was one patient in which we converted from sildenafil to riociguat, and it helped her. But the remaining, so we have done it in approximately 7 patients who are not doing well on high doses of sildenafil and tadalafil, out of which only one patient has benefited by changing over to riociguat. Now the thing is, because riociguat is direct cyclic GMP stimulator, so it is directly nitric oxide pathway acting, whereas sildenafil and tadalafil will inhibit the degradation of nitric oxide. So there are certain patients in pulmonary hypertension who have inherent nitric oxide deficiency. In those patients, riociguat might be useful.
Yes, very, very good answer. And since we are at this riociguat, now the next molecule which we wanted to discuss was about selexipag. And there is one question about this duration for which we can continue or we should continue selexipag. Is it lifelong? Is it like in Griffon study, it was continued for 36 months to show the benefit. But of course, these trials have limited period because the funding is limited. But then in our clinical practice, if you start not riociguat, selexipag, then how long you would continue it, and then can you expect the benefit? Because it has shown the benefit in terms of quality of life and other things, but mortality benefit was little so in Griffon trials. So in real life, that how long to continue, and if continued longer duration, do we expect mortality benefit as well? That is a question.
So once we
about selexipag. Selexipag.
So once we start any prostacyclin analog, it is going to be lifelong only, sir. So either we go it, we'll have we should have an endpoint to this. Either, so 3 endpoints. Either the patient is going to use it lifelong. So some other patients, what we have done, we have started on prostacyclin analogs, but they were not able to continue. So we converted them to pot shunt once there was improvement in the RV function, or refer them to a heart lung transplant. So in Indian scenario, it can be used as an interim to make the patient more suitable for high-risk procedures such as a pot shunt or a heart lung transplant.
Excellent answer. Now, similar to this tadalafil versus sildenafil, there is another question by our listeners, delegates, that between macitentan and ambrisentan, that is there any personal choice? Is it just a personal preference, or is there any scientific data evidence to decide which molecule they should use and they should prefer? That is a question by one of the delegates.
If a patient is doing well on one particular medication, whether it is bosentan or ambrisentan, my personal practice is not to change over to a new medication. Because even though we don't have a head-to-head study between bosentan, ambrisentan and macitentan, if we have a de novo patient, we definitely start with macitentan because it gives them the benefit of additional endothelin B receptor and selective endothelin receptor B antagonist. And although mortality benefit has not been studied with sildenafil and ambrisentan, we are pretty sure because it improves the hemodynamics, it improves 6-minute walk test, it improves functional class. It was just for the ease and getting the approval that the study was looking at 6-minute walk test, but definitely they would also have mortality benefit. So head on head, there is no study. If we get a new patient, we start on macitentan. If the patient is already on ambrisentan or bosentan, we continue the same and doing well.
Yeah, just one more addition. And we have seen many patients with ambrisentan developing a lot of peripheral edema. So these are the patients where, again, I can shift over them from one molecule to another and then shifting them over to macitentan. A lot of pulmonary edema, peripheral edema because of ambrisentan.
Yes, another good question by one of the delegates is about systemic sclerosis and pulmonary arterial hypertension. That is again WHO Group 1, the connective tissue disorders and this. So whether it is progressive systemic sclerosis or systemic sclerosis and pulmonary arterial hypertension, how do you work up? How do you do the workup, and what medication you would prefer in sequence or in combo? Dr. Modi, you can continue. Or Dr. Rawal, if he wants to take this question, he can take this question.
Yes, I mean, we get patients with systemic sclerosis with basically with a lot of interstitial lung disease. Okay, so as a pulmonologist perspective, first we try to always give antifibrotics, and then there are a lot of new drugs, especially in the scleroderma segment. So we have nintedanib, and then we have drug which was approved only for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, but now with the recent trials, so this drug has been approved even for systemic sclerosis with interstitial lung disease. So we try to manage these patients again by maintaining the oxygen levels, by giving antifibrotics, maybe small dose of this diuretics and steroids. And for the pulmonary hypertension, again, if these patients have predominantly ILD, we don't immediately start these patients with pulmonary vasodilators. We try to first correct their hypoxemia and then shift over these patients to vasodilators. In that, again, the dual therapy is most of the time, if the patient has severe pulmonary hypertension, we normally start with the dual therapy, maybe with phenylphylline along with the macitentan. That is what is my choice in treating these patients.
A great answer. And Dr. Rawal, do you have to add anything to this? If not, I think instead of 1.5 hours, it's already 1 hour and 40 minutes. Just a last question that I will put it, and then I think Prashant would be the better this thing, or Dr. Asif will be, because it's about cardiology. Now, the question is about CHD and pulmonary hypertension, but why only CHD, Eisenmenger, or this? I would put it as even our valvular rheumatic heart disease and subsequent pulmonary hypertension. Especially, we have already done mitral valvuloplasty. Because of little bit mitral regurgitation which is produced during our first balloon expansion, or maybe after a couple of balloon expansions, we are a little hesitant to go ahead with further higher upsizing or further high pressure mitral valvuloplasty. And then he has mitral regurgitation and some degree of residual mitral stenosis, and he is developing progressive pulmonary hypertension. So both these cases, akin, I mean, Dr. Prashant, this CHD and Eisenmenger, or our post valvular intervention, and then having persistent hypertension, which goes into the autonomous phase of pulmonary hypertension, arterial hypertension. So how do you proceed about it?
So our policy with CHD and pulmonary hypertension, especially in Eisenmenger syndrome, is to start with single pulmonary vasodilator, usually a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor, because most of these patients are usually not affording. Only when there is a progress in the pulmonary, in the symptoms, then we add the second pulmonary vasodilator. As far as a rheumatic heart disease is concerned, if you have a residual lesion, such as at least a moderate mitral stenosis and moderate mitral regurgitation, then I think we would not start on pulmonary vasodilators. Keep the patient on diuretics and maybe beta blockers, which can help in reduction in the left atrial pressure.
Actually, it becomes a class 3 indication, so whenever there's a left ventricular disease, either due to severe LV dysfunction or a mitral valve. In Eisenmenger's, we know that there's a lot of pulmonary flow going in, the lungs have been exposed to very long. So that it's more of a pre-capillary pathology, and here it's most of a post-capillary pathology. We do get, again, coming to it in general practice, we do get a lot of patients who have severe MS with high PA pressures or severe MR with high PA pressures who are on sildenafil. These patients really don't do well. In fact, it's better to stop those and concentrate more on diuretics and the valve repairs.
Yes, excellent. Dr. Asif, you raised very good point about this, the pre-capillary and post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, and our approach from the cardiology viewpoint should be drastically different. So I think it's already 1 hour 45 minutes. So it's time to close our discussion. And all dear delegates, thank you very much. I thank MSN for organizing this conference. I thank our brilliant speakers and very brilliant panelists as well for throwing light onto this very difficult topic, little unaddressed in majority of our current generation series of symposia. Good answers, good slides, good presentations. And from the delegate side also, I would say that very good questions were asked. From MSN, if there is any proper vote of thanks, I would just request somebody to...
Thank you, sir.
Vote of thanks, yes.
Yeah. So on behalf of MSN Labs Limited, once again, I would like to thank all our guest faculties for sparing your time. Though we were intent to get just 1 hour from all of you, sir, but the discussion was that meaningful and that interesting that it went into 1 hour and 45 minutes. So thank you once again from our side. And thanks a lot for making our endeavor meaningful to spread more and more awareness among the clinicians for pulmonary arterial hypertension, sir. Because as you rightly pointed out, this is an untouched phenomenon, most of the conference itself, sir. And just to share with just one slide, sir, that looking forward for your exclusive patronage for world-class international quality brands, which we have got for PS20, that is sildenafil, with the 20 mg strength, Ambrisentan, Pulmonex, and Macitentan, Rioshi we have got, as well as Rioshi, that is the Rioshi also we have got. Just to share with you, sir, that we may be the young player, but our drive and enthusiasm are the best in associating with yourself. So in this quote, sir, just I would like to thank all of yourself to spare your time once again. Thank you very much once again from my side.
Thanks, everybody. And we can call it a day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.